Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber actually ask me over on the Facebook fan page. You had made a video a couple years back showing that there were studies that showed that when people gained a certain amount of muscle mass on a multi-joint exercise versus a single joint exercise, that the study showed that even with similar amounts of muscle mass, their strength went up slightly more even when tested on the single joint exercise. Do you still feel that way, and do you feel that as a result of that, that single joint exercises have no place? Now, I'm going to use the word single joint here because isolation movements do not exist. That is a make-believe bodybuilder word. It's not based in reality, and you cannot isolate a muscle. And I want to make that very, very clear. So we try not to use that word here because it's a poorly thought out slang term. Multi-joint versus single joint is the actual scientific terms here. Now, I do some single joint exercises. I actually do a few. Oftentimes they're fairly big single joint exercises, but I do them right now. So it kind of begs that question. And here's what I would say in response to that. Generally speaking, strength is a product of what? How much muscle we have in a muscle. And again, we're only talking about in the same individual. Since we can't change other variables, we were talking about one person or their identical twin. Okay, we're not talking about comparing two different people with different structures because you can't change that. But your factors that determine how strong you are going to be muscle mass and coordination. Coordination. The ability to move and utilize multiple muscles. Now, when we test these things in these single joint exercises, they're not really single joint, right? They're not really isolated a muscle. So if I put you in a leg extension machine, someone who has learned better coordination by doing a squat is going to probably be better at getting into position and moving everything. Because you're not locked in. A lot of times the difference here is that when we lock someone down, we strap them down to where they can't move anything even an inch other than the joint we're testing. This effect does seem to go away to some extent. But a leg extension, you're not actually strapped in. You have wiggle room. You have the ability to get other muscles involved to help with the quad. So there is that factor. And because those other muscles have gotten stronger, you've learned better coordination. It's going to probably still be a little bit different on your testing the strength. So that's a factor also. But the point we come to is that, yes, generally speaking, we get better coordination, better time efficiency from big movements. We should generally be focused upon training those when our goals are strength. Now, notice I said when our goals are strength. People say, what about size? Well, there is no difference. There's no difference between size and strength for drug-free lifters. So it's the same thing. Because in order to maximize strength, you have to maximize size. Now, what we noted in there is that when size gains were equal, there seemed to be slightly more strength. Well, didn't we see the same thing in the rep studies? That when size gains were equal, people who used lower reps with heavier weight for the same tonnage to achieve the same hypertrophy in the studies, they gained slightly more 1 rep max strength. Well, yeah, that's a product of using more tension and practicing with heavier weight. And I would say our answer here, as far as single joint exercises go, is largely the same. These disparities in strength from how we choose to hypertrophy a muscle only matter in the context of what our peaking looks like. And in other words, this would matter for someone who doesn't do much 1 rep max training. Because you don't practice 1 rep maxes, this could be a big problem. Yes, your maxes are going to probably go up less if you use a lot of single joint exercises to build the same muscle. That, and it's really time inefficient. Bad use of gym resources. Bad use of time management for most people. Like if you're doing 6 different single joint exercises every week, that's a bad use of time management. Or if you're doing 7 or 8. Like if you're doing one for every muscle in your body, it's poor time management. But let's come back over to the point. If you built some muscles up using it, but you're still doing maxes, I think the difference is going to go away. Why? Because 1 rep max training is your best form of training, and I use that word loosely, for learning to display maximum strength. Because when we test these things, even in a lab, we're testing a display of strength. It helps you actualize your strength potential. And that's the difference, I would say, is that single joint exercises are still hypertrophying a muscle. If you are hypertrophying a muscle, your strength potential goes up. It's just that it takes more work to actualize the strength potential because you didn't build them with a more complex movement that teaches you coordination and teaches you muscular skeletal coordination under load, which is what we're looking at. They don't develop the skill. They don't develop the skill of lifting heavier. But they develop the potential because the potential is hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is where we get the overwhelming majority of our strength. It's where we get the overwhelming majority of it. So, over to the point. Why would we use them for hypertrophy at all? A couple of reasons. Number one, sometimes a smaller exercise will work a head or a plane of a muscle that we are not able to hit as thoroughly and as effectively with the bigger lift. For example, you saw me doing closed grip presses. Now you see me doing these skull crushers with chains to where I get that stretch behind the head at the bottom. Well, that stretch behind the head at the bottom gives me a little more long head activation. The long head doesn't get ideal activation on a closed grip press. Doesn't get ideal activation. Now, people could make the point, well, if it doesn't get ideal activation, then is it going to increase your bench press much to work on it? Probably not. Probably not. But the triceps are, for someone like me, a weak link in my benching and pressing in general. Adding as much meat as I can everywhere on my tricep could benefit me. Why? Because what happens if I need to do a different press? What happens if I need to do a press, such as an overhead press that does use more long head and I haven't developed it? Well, it's going to still be a weak link. Number two, sometimes putting meat on everywhere on a lagging muscle can facilitate growth through the whole muscle. Okay? And by working a different angle like this, we're possibly reducing overuse injuries. And we're creating more stability. If you have a muscle that's a weak link in general, and maybe on some of the big movements you're doing only two of the heads contributes significantly, still having an underdeveloped head there could contribute to joint stability somewhere that has an injury problem. So it still would behoove you to make sure you develop all the heads of a weak muscle, even heads that don't maybe contribute so much to your movement pattern. Why? Because again, it's a general weak link. Other cases, you just need to develop it. You know, you have a muscle that's lagging, you just realize I need to build that muscle all the way around. So that exercise might address a performance element that's not otherwise being utilized. How about recovery? How about recovery, inflammation, overuse of joints? In many cases, smaller single joint exercises can cause inflammation, right? In many cases, they are more inflammation prone than their bigger counterparts. Well, this is where you have to assess it. If I were doing a tricep extension like that in a way that puts a lot of tension on the tendons of my elbows, it would be a little different, wouldn't it? I could be causing extra inflammation. Well, you pick a single joint exercise that doesn't. In that case, the one I'm doing is actually very low inflammation. But my delts are usually fried. By the time I get to something like a tricep extension, my delts hurt, my shoulders are fatigued. And if you don't have room for another big exercise because you have other support muscles that are not going to let you overload any further because they're too tired, or the other muscles are so fatigued and you still have recovery left for that lagging muscle, then you need to come in and train it with a single joint exercise. Now, I'm not talking about novice lifters here, guys, because novice lifters don't have these issues. If a novice lifter needs bigger triceps, they probably need to do more closed grip pressing. If they need bigger biceps, they probably need to do more chin-ups. But there's a threshold to where this doesn't work. We can only handle so much volume in a given session, especially some of our muscles. We reach the maximum recoverable volume for a certain muscle. In this case, like my front delts, they get really fatigued from all the pressing. I've noticed even a bigger exercise like a JM press. Or a dip, sometimes my delts are giving out. Well, if I need to get extra tricep work in, you're going to have to do that. Same thing, take something like a shrug. Well, what if your traps aren't getting quite enough work from all your deadlifting and other pulls? Shrugs hammer the traps harder than a lot of the big exercises do. So it might make sense for someone to work that in. Or, again, let's talk about other performance elements. Something like a shrug not only hits the traps really hard, it's a good grip training tool. Good grip training tool. So we have to look at these different single joint exercises and ask ourselves, do I have the recovery to do another big movement to continue to hit this muscle that needs extra work in this training session? If the answer is no, then it makes sense to use a single joint exercise. It shouldn't be our default position. We shouldn't just by default say, oh, I'm just going to do a single joint exercise. Because it's not efficient time management. It's not always efficient use of resources. So we have to assess that. We have to look at what's going on with our overall fatigue through the rest of the body. And there are going to be a lot of muscles to where it just makes sense. It becomes intelligent. It becomes the reasonable way to approach things. In the case right there, example, triceps. Well, usually in that workout, I did 3 different heavy presses already. My triceps still had recovery left and they're a lagging muscle. It makes sense at that point to use the smaller exercise. No reason to be dogmatic about it with the big movement. Yes, the big movements are generally superior until they aren't. Until you don't have the recovery left in other muscles to perform. And you're leaving gains on the table for a critical muscle like maybe the triceps. You got to assess it case by case. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.